Conversations.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Strong Conversations, Hot Takes from a Cultural Firebrand. I am Dr. Carolyn Strong, said Cultural Firebrand. And today we will be talking about racism in children and the growing health concerns that go along with that. And I have some amazing experts, as usual, lined up for you all. But before I bring them on, I do just kind of want to talk about what kicked this off for me. And it was this article about racism, that the racism that Black kids are enduring is spiraling into a health crisis. And this article kind of talks about how we knew that the race related stress was causing mental health concerns, but now a growing number of pediatricians are seeing that it's causing physical concerns as well. So, of course, when I talk about something, I'm going to bring the most qualified people on to talk about that. So I have done that for you today. And so starting off, we have pediatrician Dr. Carrie Lockhart. Welcome.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great. And per usual, you know I don't do a bunch of bio reading. You are the you expert. So tell us what you want us to know.
I'll be as quick as possible. Born and raised on the west side of Chicago, west side. And that's how we met. I went to Northwestern, so that's how we met. But I was born and raised on the west side of Chicago. And it was really having a lot of experiences with asthma as a kid. I still have asthma now, but it was really poorly controlled. And so I spent a lot of time in and out of the hospital. My mom has really severe asthma. And so through those experiences, I was in the hospital a lot. And from there, I was like, well, I want to be a baby doctor. I had no idea what that meant, no idea how to do that. First doctor in my family. And so we just kind of planted our feet on that path, my family. And when I say my family, my extended family, my grandparents, my aunts, uncles, my mom.
I know what we mean when we say family.
Right. So we did that. And lo and behold, I got there after, years of trying and lots of money that we found from, grandma, people here and there. And so I was really excited when I got there. I went to residency at my first choice, Loyola in Maywood. I did my medical school downstate at SIU School of Medicine after doing their post-bac. And really, my journey through medical school was great, supportive. Many people find residency to be a challenge. And I had some challenges, personal challenges through residency, but I loved my residency program. Well, I got out and started practicing, and it was not too long after that I started to realize that what I imagined practice to be was not in line with what I wanted to do. I wanted to go back into my community and, I didn't understand at the time as a child, but I wanted to, promote and facilitate health equity. And I just felt very limited in my ability to be able to do that as a clinician. And I know that there are many clinicians who are able to do that, but where I found myself, I just didn't feel like I could do that well. And so after about almost 10 years, it's about 9.5 years in clinical medicine, in addition to, some things that we will probably talk about a little bit later, I left clinical medicine, and that it'll be 2 years in about 3 weeks that I left clinical medicine and moved into a different space that still allows me to focus on health equity, but in a different way, outside of medicine, with a group of people who are really committed to looking at what's, many people, when they hear this word, they're like, oh, I'm curious, but they don't quite what we do, but we do trauma-informed, trauma-responsive leadership training. And what we endeavor to do is, help organizations change their culture. And I primarily work in the healthcare space, but we do this with any industry, really. It's Lodestar Consulting and Executive Coaching. And I really found my people. A
Well,
lot of physicians, a lot of psychologists. Yeah, I
awesome.
found my people. So I'm doing that. I've been doing that for about, again, like a little over 2 years, because I started doing a little bit of work with them. And so I, get to help really think about what trauma means, and not in just trauma in the traditional sense that many of us think of, to help shift cultures and leadership styles in organizations.
That is amazing. I welcome you, and I thank you for taking the time to spend with me today to talk about this, because you know how much this has been eating at me.
I know. Thank you for having me. We've been having this conversation offline for a while, so I'm excited we made it happen.
Thank you. So we have our MD space, and in our mental health space, we have Dr. Tiffany, friend to the show. Hey, girl. Hey.
Hey, how are you?
I'm awesome. How are you?
I'm good.
Tell the people about you. You know how this go. You expert.
My name is Dr. Tiffany. I have been a psychologist for over 20 years. I call myself a psychologist for the culture because in the work that I do, I center the needs of Black and Brown folks. As it relates to working with children and adolescents, I have worked with children and adolescents for over 20 years in every setting that you imagine, from school, residential treatment, juvenile justice. And one of the things, no matter what the setting, you see some of the same things. You are seeing exposure to trauma. You are seeing a failure for our community to actively address it in a non-punitive way. And so as a part of my private practice, I also work currently in a hospital, consistently focusing, as Dr. Lockhart said, on this idea of equity and making sure that we have the resources available for our community, specifically as we talk about this topic today related to racism, trauma, and how that's showing up physically and emotionally for our kids.
Well, welcome. Thank you. So you'll be covering our mental health space. We've been talking about this too. I've been bugging everybody about this. Y'all know this has been irritating my spirit since I saw this article. And I'm like, I gotta have this conversation or I am going to explode. But I do want to start because I know that in addition to the article, one of the books that was recommended was it My Grandmother's Hands, and it talks about trauma in terms of people of color specifically. And one of the things that stuck with me was the quote, "The answer to why so many of us have difficulty is because our ancestors spent centuries here under relentless, brutal conditions." Sounds familiar. Generation after generation, our bodies stored trauma and intense survival energy and passed these on to our children and grandchildren. Most of us also pass down resilience and love, of course, but as we saw with my grandmother, and as we see with so many other human beings, resilience and love aren't sufficient enough to heal all trauma. So, taking into consideration that not much has changed, how do we move forward with our children when not only are they carrying everything here, but they're also dealing with new trauma that we get from being African American on a daily basis?
I'm happy to start. I think this is something I think about often, especially since I've, had the privilege really to spend some time healing from a lot of traumas I've experienced, over not only my life, but professionally. And recognizing that there are so many of us who are exposed to trauma every day, most of us Black people, and we don't even know it, So I think the moving forward part starts with education. I haven't finished My Grandmother's Hands, and I was listening to it, and I read so many different things about trauma, but I think it was in his book when he talked about how we learn things and and pass it. We kind of pass those things down, and then eventually, you're passing down behaviors, but then eventually it becomes embedded in how our DNA structure changes as a result of those traumas. And so if we are not even aware that, like, at a cellular level, we can be affecting one generation to the next. He has a lovely quote that essentially says, decontextualize trauma in a behavior, trauma in a person can look like personality. Decontextualize trauma in a community can look like culture, and decontextualize trauma in a family can look like familial traits or something like that. And so I think the more we can first start to educate ourselves about what does it look like when I'm having, I say, in our Lodestar community, we say activation rather than trigger for a lot of reasons. When I'm activated by trauma, and then how am I responding, modeling that, and then start educating other people so we can just start to have the conversation. Because when you read about it, it can seem really hopeless.
And I agree. I think we definitely need to kind of educate about it. I also think we need to stop normalizing it, right? That this is just an expectation of how life is for us. And I think even when we're having the conversations about resiliency, I constantly struggle with that, because we are saying this ongoing trauma is an expectation, and that we're going to praise you for being able to deal with it, right? Instead of saying, first of all, what you've gone through and continue to go through is unacceptable.
And not normal.
Not normal. And that the feelings that you have about them are valid, and you should be able to have those feelings and be able to process them through. But we don't do that piece. And we know about epigenetics and how they began that study with the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And that's where they were finding out kind of that trauma housed in your DNA. So for one, we need to acknowledge that we do have some of that. And then how is that affecting how we present now? And then what are the things that we do educationally, denormalizing, as well as also kind of actively resisting that this is okay, and making that room to process it. Because if we clap one more time at a child and share another story of a child who's in the middle of trauma, who became successful, and we say, yay, look, this is wonderful, versus how sad is this that you went through so much. We can still be happy that you have been successful, but then even how are we defining success? And does that mean that you still don't have the impact of that trauma? And then it's not going to show up somewhere else, because we're not giving you the room or space to even acknowledge that you have it.
Whew. You got me about to pass the collection plate, Sora. Yes. Yeah.
So now here's my question, even with all of that, because in addition to all of the things that are coming from outside, how do we destigmatize help from within? Because we can acknowledge this all day long, but for a lot of us, getting help is a sign of weakness. Getting help is a sign that you didn't pray enough. Getting help is a sign that how much time have you spent doing other things or whatever that may be, before we actually try to get help to deal with some of these very real issues that are causing very real problems, both mentally and physically.
And I think that some of what Dr. Lockhart had said about education is in multiple areas. One is being able to have the conversation with our community around the stigmas associated with receiving mental health services. And one of the things we say is who would not feel depressed, angry, anxious if they had all this stuff going on. So we have to kind of do the destigmatizing part. We then also have to engage in the idea of behavioral health equity. How are we making sure that once we get you to say, maybe I'll seek help, then do we have help that's available to you that is culturally informed.
Mm-hmm.
We within psychology right now, we are on this movement about decolonizing psychology because it's very westernized. It's not taking into consideration culture, oppression, all of those things that communities of color are facing. So we have to, for one, educate our community and have really honest conversations about mental health and the stigma. And then we need to make sure that when we are getting you into this space to have therapy, to engage with practitioners, that they're doing it from a culturally informed lens that also recognizes all of the trauma that you're experiencing directly and through network stress.
Yeah. I mean, all of that, all of it. It reminds me of medicine, when you get someone finally to go to the doctor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they are met with a doctor who is riddled with implicit bias, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
explicit bias.
Mm-hmm.
And, the experience is horrible. And that person's never going to come back again, right? One of the things I think that becomes really critical is those of us who know better or who have, again, I often highlight the privilege that I've had to heal and to be in spaces where I have been able to grow. One of the real struggles that I had in medicine that helped move me out of clinical medicine was that I have ADHD. And it appears that I've always had it, but after a breast cancer diagnosis as an intern, and one of the treatments, I had a severe side effect to that. And it really had ADHD that was manageable. And I say that loosely, manageable, because that means often you're working 10 times as hard as everyone else to keep up with everyone. I was working 10 times as hard. After the medicine and the side effects, the bottom fell out, right? And so what I noticed was a lot of shame around having ADHD and not being able to do things like everyone else, needing accommodations and things like that as a physician. When I finally dealt with the shame, then you can't get me to shut up about having ADHD. And what that led to was so many other Black women doctors reaching out to me, and sometimes privately, sometimes publicly, asking for guidance or support. Or I even have one friend who told me, because of you being so vocal, I went back on my medicine for my ADHD. And so when I think of how do we destigmatize it, it's through shared experiences and shared stories. Like, anyone who's on my Facebook will be like, yeah, we know Carrie has ADHD. We know she has a therapist. We know, because I think the more we normalize it, like, people can look at me from the outside and they're thinking like, oh, she's a doctor. She doesn't have any of those. And the more we talk about, no, I struggle with trauma. We all do. As Black people, if you live in America, it is a traumatic experience.
Pervasive and ongoing.
And I try to highlight for people, I was reminded when I was reading Cast about 3 years ago about like my friends will tell you, also Carrie is protecting her telomeres. That is my whole goal. And so for people who don't know, your telomeres are the ends of your DNA strands. And as we get older, they naturally get shorter and shorter. And as they get shorter, you are more susceptible to certain diseases and illnesses. Well, while we may all look like Black girl and Black boy magic, when we look at our telomeres, if they compare us to age match white people, like, health the same, our telomeres are shorter compared to them. And study after study, you will see this in Resmaa Menachem's book. I believe it's in there, but definitely in Cast. And I know the page 304, she talks about how exposure to racialized trauma shortens our telomeres. So the more we talk about it and let people know, like, trauma is not this thing that you can just push down and say, I'm going to ignore it. Whether we ignore it or not, our bodies tell the story.
See, you lucky I don't know how to spell telomeres, because y'all already know it would be a t-shirt already. Y'all know how I get down. I'm
Look,
the
I'll
graphic
put it
designer on speed dial.
Right, protecting my telomeres. And I'm like,
Protecting
what is
my
that?
telomeres. It's coming.
There
It's coming to the Strong Conversation shop.
I will buy it.
So taking that into consideration, it kind of brings me back to my next topic, which is ACEs. Now, anybody that's had to listen to any of my rants knows that as an educator, I firmly believe that anytime someone is entering school, they need to engage in an ACEs assessment, because that not only for me would help teachers to understand what they're dealing with, how they need to navigate. It would give the social emotional learning team a heads up on what it is that they may experience. So I guess my question to the two of you in your respective fields, how would already having that information, just like you get every other piece of demographic information that comes with a child when they come to see either of you, how would that be beneficial to you, or would it?
I guess if you're saying, if we have it as a psychologist, if they're coming, for one, if we weren't given it, we're going to ask about it anyway, because that's a part of a comprehensive assessment that we're going to do. Within our setting, yes, that should inform our treatment interventions. That should inform our treatment goals, what resources within the community that we may need to also help the family access. My difficulty is that in other settings that are not mental health settings, that information, unfortunately, could be utilized in a problematic way to then justify not giving resources or negating the ability of a child. Because if we're sitting here and saying, oh, they have family members locked up. For as a therapist, family members locked up, I'm going to want to talk to you about issues of grief, loss, because it is a loss, abandonment, issues of shame around how the world sees people who are locked up, some fatalistic thinking, because it's like, hey, you either die or get locked up. How is that affecting your mental health? But we know that if you're coming from a family with domestic violence, that how they're going to then view your caregivers and the input from your caregivers and concerns, depending upon the setting. I find in some of our settings, instead of saying that's where we give grace and compassion, we then say they deserve less. And we don't use that as a way of there's more intervention needed and there's more support. The less ACEs you have, the more we believe that you deserve compassion, and the more we believe that if you make mistakes, that you deserve to be given a second chance, versus how we should look at it is, wow, if you have all of these ACEs, if you show up here, whether it's in child welfare, juvenile justice, problems in school, we should say, of course you have these. You need support. But instead, those are the same factors that we use to negate giving you the support that you need.
So you fear it'll be weaponized?
It already is. I mean, you see it in child welfare. You see it in juvenile justice. You see it in school settings. Oh, their daddy's in jail. That's why they act this way. And so the less patience versus saying, wow, their father is incarcerated. That has got to cause some anxiety for this child and some grief.
Okay.
Yeah. So ACEs just follow me everywhere I go in terms of the information in pediatrics. So Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, I think it's almost 10 years ago, did the famous TED Talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And so as a pediatrician, that's really important to us. I know 10 years ago when she did that TED Talk, many people were not screening at all for it. When at one of the health centers that I worked, we routinely screened for it. And just to give a little bit of context for why it's even important, we look at ACEs in the work that I do now, because fundamentally ACEs is was the first large scale study that looked at what embodied trauma does to us. So we know that just being proximate to an experience, having a father a parent who's incarcerated, a parent with mental illness, losing a parent, and all these are before the age of 18. Childhood abuse. I can't remember all of them, but it was only 10 questions. Just having, the more you have, the more compound, like it's compounded. I mean, that it increases your risk for all of these other health problems long term. So not even just your behavior in the moment, so to your point, Dr. Tiffany, like a child whose father or mom is incarcerated, absolutely, we expect that there's going to be some grief behavior around that, and it doesn't look the way we think it looks, right? Long term, there's the potential for health problems, high blood pressure, heart disease. And this is without regard for lifestyle choices, which is so critical, because the initial thought was, well, of course, these folks who have these higher ACEs are making poor decisions. Nope. When you normalize for decision making, it's still increased. 3 or more, you have a higher risk, right? Well, this was the kicker. 70% of that population that they did these ACEs on were upper middle class white people. So this was not a population that theoretically, by societal standards at that time, would be people you'd expect to have high ACE scores. So what does that tell us? The folks who are making these assumptions about, the kids, that, we're seeing with the trouble are really misunderstanding ACEs. We know that 64% of our society has at least one ACE, and they tend to cluster. I mean, when we talk about increased risk of psychiatric disease, the percent that stays in my head is if you have, I think it's 3 or more ACEs, your risk of death by suicide increases, or attempt at suicide increases by 12% just by having ACEs. And so it's important for me, having an ACE then tells me that this family, I want to get curious about some resources. And that's what we did in the health center that and there was an option. You could decline the ACE questionnaire, and then you do it. And once you fill it out, it tallied your score, and then it would automatically, send you a list, give you a list of resources, including having a home visit. And so on the one hand, it looks like, oh, wow, everyone's going to go and look in Google and do their ACE score. That score is not a foregone conclusion. Having one safe adult in a child's life can absolutely change the trajectory. I met someone who shared with me that they had one of the highest ACE scores I'd ever heard of. It wasn't 10, but it was really high. And this person has an above average IQ, is an amazing and lovely person, not with any health issues, not, doing well. And it's because of the mitigation that was done. So the things I, think are important for us to recognize, ACEs tell us about embodied trauma, and it also tells us what happens when we mitigate that trauma. So for the people who don't understand that, they are re-traumatizing and not mitigating an already traumatized child or adult.
Yeah, I was going to say Dr. Strong is muted.
I am indeed muted, but it worked because we were literally saying the same thing at the same time. I said, or adult. So it worked out that I was muted. So folks didn't think there was an echo here. But I will say that that last statement, Dr. Lockhart, was the perfect segue to my next question, because Dr. Nifley, I believe it's at the University of Cincinnati, has done a study that said that kids as early as the age of 6 experience their first microaggressions. So my question is, what language can we give parents to either try to get ahead of this happening in spaces or to mitigate it when it does?
I think one of the things I'm a firm believer in that at times we choose to not use language. We choose to not give explanation, thinking that if we avoid having the conversations, it will not happen. I think my child was probably about 6 when I actually said, that's a microaggression. They weren't going to remember what that term meant. And then we talked about this idea of that there are going to be people who are going to say things about you that are not true, that hurt your feelings, whether it's about not being able to pronounce your name, talking about your hair, your skin, just because of who you are. And although that information is incorrect and hurtful, they're going to do it because of who you are. And then how do we also support you in making space for to be angry and upset and saying that this is not right? And then we say it's not right and they shouldn't. But I think sometimes we try to say, oh, it's okay. And we don't explain it, or we try to minimize the feelings versus naming it, telling them what it is and saying, yeah, they said something hurtful and untrue. And sometimes we tell them they said it because you're Black. And then we have to make room for that, or because you're a Black girl, or because you're darker skinned, or whatever they're doing it from. And then we talk about how unfair it is. And we talk about that it's wrong and that it's untrue, but that there are people who are saying these things because their goal is to hurt you, and to know that and to not make it acceptable. And you don't have to deal with those people as much as you would. And then as parents, we also have to, when it's happening from adults, I have been that person that I'm going to let my child see me have that conversation with that adult about how you do not say these things to my child. And so I can show you that I advocate for you, and that I also am going to show you that advocacy is needed in this moment.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I think, so many parents can struggle with how to address that. Do I say something? Will I make them feel bad if I tell them that these things exist in the world? And Dr. Tiffany hit the nail on the head. It exists. And you don't want the first time that your child learns about microaggressions or racism to be from a stranger, and because it's happening to them. And so I actually, again, like I was telling you all, sometimes I get into these perfectionistic places, and I don't say that proudly, because that is also a source of trauma when you're getting into this perfectionistic place. And so I was reading more, and actually I last week, and then I read some more yesterday. I did learn a new framing, a word. I didn't know that it was called that, but it sounds like exactly what you were talking about, Dr. Tiffany, and you probably know it. It's called racial and ethnic socialization. And essentially, it's exactly what you said. It's, specifically having very clear messages to your kid about, like elevating their identity. It could be really explicit, like buying books, with Black characters and television shows. It can be implicit, where, when you're watching something on TV and it doesn't vibe right with, and you're like, I don't really like that Black character doing this. But it's really teaching your children that their identity and who they are is valuable, and kind of edifying them in that way. And then it's having those conversations, like you said, Dr. Tiffany, so I won't repeat all of that, but I didn't know that it had a name, and they have trainings for parents to do it, because I'd like to, say that this isn't natural all the time. Dealing with racism day in and day out, we know that it absolutely affects our children. The ACEs, the original 10 had nothing about marginalization in that 10. And there have been some criticisms in recent years about that. So if you can imagine the 10 questions on there, and I think 64% had at least one. Imagine if they added the, race, and other forms of oppression on that questionnaire.
And they actually have one. I think it's the Racist Center, where they actually began to add ones around issues of racism. And I agree. I think when it comes to racial and ethnic socialization, is that we struggle against a society that is constantly saying that we need to be colorblind and they don't see color. We, in this moment, in January being Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, you hear so many people saying, not the color of skin, content of character. And so there's this constant, if you address issues of race and ethnicity, then somehow you are being a bad person. And I always say, at this point in time, I love being Black. Let me say that. Love being Black. Want to stay that way.
Yes.
But I think, even if we got to this idea of this colorblind society, we are not there now because our children are still experiencing the world through a racial lens. The world deals with them based upon their presentation. And so we have to have those conversations and be open about it. And I think sometimes there's this pressure to not. That when you bring up Blackness, when you bring up our history and even our present and issues of racism, then people say, there you go. You always want to bring this up. And it's like, unfortunately, that's the society that we live in at this point in time. And I need to help my child navigate through this world.
Oh, that's when you become a race baiter.
That is correct.
Baiter, race hater.
Been called that.
Racist, and I'm like, is there a troll handbook
or racist? You become racist as a Black person, yes.
But is there a troll handbook? Because every single troll that I encounter in my inbox always uses the same language. Like, do they have meetings?
Yeah. This is what's so interesting. I loved that Resmaa Menakem highlights this, and I think it's worth essentially white people thinking about the vicarious trauma that's experienced in watching anyone be harmed, traumatized it doesn't escape you. So he had these just really amazing questions that he shows. He says, I don't, want to, tell the whole book. I haven't gotten very far, but there's this part in his book. He says in his, I don't know if it's his class, but he shows this scene from 12 Years a Slave, essentially where it's this dehumanizing scene of Ejiofor. Is that his last name? The actor?
Ejiofor, I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. And in the scene, there's a white enslaver who the mother is begging him not to separate her family. And it sounds like another white man is like, don't you have any compassion? Don't do this. Don't separate them. And he's like, my compassion stretches about as wide as a penny. And then he separates them.
Wow.
And so then he, cuts the scene and he invites them to, start to reflect on how do they feel. First, how do they think he feels? Do they think he feels absolutely nothing? And if he does, what is it that you have to tell yourself to get yourself to get to that point that you can look at another human being and suffering and not have any compassion, right?
Well, I think that was step one, wasn't it? They're not human.
In enslavement time, yeah. Mm-hmm. But I think that's the thing when we're thinking about these people trolling, like there's some like reasoning that goes on there that is not quite a dehumanization yet. And if they sat down and were now not everyone, but there's some folks who are literally just rationalizing and pushing down that trauma as well. And you haven't addressed the vicarious traumas because you don't realize vicarious trauma, which is trauma that you witness someone else experiencing, and primary trauma, trauma that happens to you. The brain doesn't care. It doesn't know a difference.
And that
So the
actually
same way,
answered my next question is, does the body know a difference between network stress and direct stress?
And I think when we talk about network stress, that's that stress that happens. Network is that key word, right? Is that your network when we kind of think about that? So we're talking about your friends, your family, your community, versus direct stress. It's happening to you. And, one of the things that we have been able to figure out is that even in this time when they've been doing during the time of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, where they talked about this vicarious racial trauma, like you started hearing that more. Because they're saying we've seen our deaths being filmed. We've seen how society is responding to when harm is happening to our communities, and it's justified. And sometimes there's celebration and GoFundMe's to support the people who kill us, right? And so all of it is still stress, and the body is still feeling it that way.
Stress,
right? It's still releasing those hormones that we kind of use to kind of manage stress. So our body just knows it is stress, and we're experiencing it. And so it's going to do those things like high blood pressure and heart disease on top of depression and anxiety and this constant state of, and I think the thing that we don't realize sometimes in our children is when we're living in a world where we're seeing justification for our death, when we are seeing GoFundMe's for people who kill us, when we're going into our schools and we're having this failure to even acknowledge our trauma, whether it's in our books, whether it's in even being able to have a discussion. And then we, on top of that, are living it with the microaggressions and things that are happening to us. We go into this constant state. We don't ever get the chance to come down. The hormone stays. And so you become at this heightened level all the time where you're constantly in fight or flight. And how is that impacting our children, and how are systems seeing them when you're constantly in this state of fight or flight? Concentration issues are happening, depression and anxiety, irritability, all of these things are occurring. And we look at it as a behavioral problem versus a systemic racism problem, versus a living in America as a Black person problem, or living anywhere as a Black person problem. And so we're not addressing the trauma in our Blackness. Again, Blackness is a beautiful thing, but we also have to acknowledge that it comes with some very difficult lived experiences.
Yeah. I often, have seen people say Blackness is not the problem, white supremacism is, and so we ask the question often in our, work, what does it mean to be chronically unsafe? And so, again, Dr. Tiffany described perfectly. That's what the system is doing. Cortisol is a natural it increases naturally when you are in fight or flight. You have to run from a dog, or you hear a loud bang, and that's a normal response. Those temporary fluctuations are okay. But when you are chronically unsafe, which for many of us is what living in America is. And again, those who are aware and intend to push it down, whether you know it or not, you are as well, because vicarious trauma, again, you are experiencing it, seeing George Floyd, even though he doesn't look like you or your son. We are all experiencing this trauma, and not in the same ways, by no means. But again, trauma also doesn't care whether your trauma is from fear from a roller coaster or fear from, watching a loved one, suffer from cancer. Trauma lands to the brain the same. And so as I think of, because then it sounds like doom and gloom, like, well, we're chronically unsafe. What do we do? Then it becomes really critical for us to then think about, well, what power do I have in my hands? And not everyone has the privilege. I want to be clear. That's where those of us with the privilege, continue to push the systems, continue to model and get, our communities really recognizing. I mean, literally today I was doing work listening to bilateral stimulation music. I just learned about it about a month and a half ago. And I heard it's really good for people with ADHD, neurodivergent people, but it's also EMDR for trauma. And new music always distracts me. I study with music anyway, or do work with music. But this was new, but it was amazing. And so learning ways to heal your, traumas, whether it's connecting with a therapist, connecting with, community, so that we can start to do what we can. And then those of us who have the privilege push the system.
So I guess my final question is, given what is within our power to do, how do we can't undo any of this because you can't put the horse back in the barn, but what is it through each individual lens that we need to be intentional about to mitigate it? Because you can't undo it. It is what it is. And the DNA part, our DNA is what it is.
So here's the thing. The study that Dr. Tiffany mentioned was actually, again, another hopeful one, because even though your DNA can be changed by trauma, they saw improvements in one generation with, doing some of those protective, healing things around trauma. So you can change your DNA. And that study was so fascinating to me. I mentioned it to everyone, and I can never remember the person who did the study. So I love that you mentioned that, because I was like, should I mention it? It's not about Black people. I would love for someone to do a study like that for Black people. I think, with I don't know, I really want us to address some of the, we talk about vicarious trauma being one of the things that you can control in some ways. The scrolling on social media, watching the news. I have not found the balance between staying informed and completely checking out. For months now, I've completely checked out. I don't watch any news. And then, like, literally in the past 2 weeks, because I was recovering from a minor procedure, I started watching news again. And thankfully, it hasn't been too much going on locally. And so it hasn't been terrible. But literally last night, I was like, okay, you're slipping back into a bad habit. But you can control that vicarious trauma by not looking at those things on social media. It's something I talk with my family about all the time. I'm like, you don't need to know how many carjackings there were today. Is it going to change how safe you're going to be when you go out? No. It literally, I remember during the pandemic, I was never a person who was afraid to move about the city. COVID has started to let up a little bit. It was summertime. I had friends coming to the city who were from Chicago but out of town. I was afraid to leave my house. And I kept blaming it on COVID, but I was really terrified because of all the carjackings I was seeing every year, every day. And I finally realized you've got to stop. And so we can do small things, decreasing our exposure to vicarious trauma. I know that the question that we talked a lot about is, what do we do in the pediatrician's office? Or, when we come in contact with a physician and we feel like, there's some activation coming up because we're being dismissed. It always starts with us in terms of, first, we have to recognize that, like, wait a second, I'm triggered, I'm activated. What, maybe if you can first notice that in your body, because it usually starts in the body, then there's the potential to address it. If we don't notice it before it's out of the body, we're like ready to pop off, it's usually a little too late, but not always. And then you can get a little curious about, well, what is making me activated? Oftentimes my activation comes around feeling belittled or dismissed. I haven't unpacked that yet. I don't know where that came from, some childhood thing, I'm sure. And so starting there, and then you can, and that you can do that really quickly once you start to practice, because now I'm like, why am I feeling dismissed? Like in 3 seconds, like, This
See.
person is not even, and so it becomes about you. So then the goal is to be able to step into choice about how you want to address it. Not because it's not about what they're doing, but I don't want to be the person who's going off on, the doctor. I don't want to be interpreting their behavior because I want you to explain your behavior. So when someone is being inappropriate or racist or says an inappropriate joke, I'm not going to get upset and try to predict that I know what you're saying or mean. I'm like, why did you say that? Now, all of a sudden, all of the responsibility is on them to be responsible for their words.
That's one of my favorite bias interrupters is let's unpack that. I need you to say more about that.
Yeah. And so that's what I want parents, Black parents especially, to one, feel empowered that you can ask, you absolutely should ask when a doctor says something that lands like, what, or why are you speaking to me that way? Sometimes it feels like I'm not going to, because they need to give you an explanation, not I'm going to pop off and go off on them, because no, now they need to explain to you why they think it's okay for them to talk to you that way. And so those kinds of questions, why are you speaking to me that way? Why are you dismissing my question? Why are you not explaining to me? Because sometimes I've had families who want antibiotics, for example, and their child doesn't need it. It doesn't matter that I know their child doesn't need it. It matters that I haven't explained things clear enough so that they can leave feeling reassured. So that's my responsibility to take the time and do that. And so if I haven't done that, a parent is well within their right to say, why haven't you explained it clear enough to me why my child doesn't need an antibiotic? And so those kinds of things are where I want us to get to, so that when we're in a situation and we feel like there's bias, racism, or whatever, you make people explain their behavior to you.
And I'll say, as a psychologist, some of the things that we know that this is like a multi-pronged, multi-system issue. Mm-hmm. We have to, for one, the children and adolescents exist within systems. You can't kind of address issues of racism, racial stress, vicarious trauma, direct stress, any of that without the recognition of educating the systems. So we have to do a better job of educating the educators, child welfare, juvenile justice systems, churches, after school programs, all of these different systems in which they engage at those larger systems about vicarious trauma, about holding them accountable for talking about ACEs, and especially when we're adding issues around historically excluded communities. And what do you do with that information? Because I know within those systems, I'm always like, so because they have had more going on, you give them less chances versus saying they have so much going on. They need more chances than anyone, right? They need more support, more interventions versus being punitive. So we have to kind of educate, and those who have the privilege and the ability to hold those systems accountable. We then need to have those conversations with caregivers about mental health stigma, about resiliency, not being such the goal that we fail to acknowledge that resiliency, the basis of being resilient is that you had to have experienced a trauma. So we seem to forget that when we're saying, oh, our kids are resilient. The trauma is the basis of resiliency. So we have to acknowledge that trauma that's happened, and within our familial systems, make space for our children to kind of experience those feelings and talk about those experiences that have in those feelings that come with those traumas. We then need to make sure that we are looking at what are culturally informed healing practices, coping strategies that we then do not just at the time of trauma, but that we actually are being proactive and teaching children about how to express your feelings, emotional regulation, de-stress tolerance, other strategies for coping that work for you, and making the space for that to happen in order to really make this work. Because we can't just say vicarious trauma. We have to say, okay, well, what do we do? And we also know that if your child exists long enough in a Black body, they're going to experience some form of either network stress or direct stress related specifically to racial trauma. And so if we know that, why are we not having these conversations to start? And then preparing them as much as we can and making that space for when we're having kind of these ups and downs of stress. Because as we know, as you're talking about cortisol, the goal is for it to kind of help you deal with the stress. And so part of it is if we're able to keep the stress from getting as heightened and staying so high, because we're already implementing some of these strategies with our children, then we're going to have better outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah. The system has always been in my mind, like, one of my friends laughs at me because I'm like, just burn it all down. Of course, no. But the system is where we have to start. I meant to piggyback on this earlier when you talked about resilience. Resilience, like, it's been so cringe in the past several years because people really think about resilience as this one-way valve, like output, output, output. Resilience is truly based on how much you can withstand under impossible conditions, right? And resilience is not a one-way valve. It is a in and out container. Like, you have to be putting stuff in if people are pouring stuff out. We talk about sustainable resilience, not weaponized resilience. This idea that, like, you're so resilient if you can withstand pressure under impossible and egregious circumstances, versus resilience is not only about what is within you, it is what is coming from without. So your family, your employer, the finances your employer pays, what you do to restore you. But I was speaking on a panel, and this leader, it was all women on the panel. She said, you cannot out yoga a bad organization. And so people often tell you, like, using like these self-care measures to keep yourself resilient. And then we do this with our children. Well, I went to school, uphill 2 ways in the snow.
Oh my
You
God.
can do that. And
it's been ridiculous this last week because, they closed school because of the cold and snow. And so the amount, I'm sorry to jump in, but
No, absolutely. I'm agreeing with you. Yeah.
The amount of parents that were online talking about these kids are soft, especially in Chicago. They're like, CPS never closed. When Chicago started closing? They never closed for us. And it's like, okay, when you know better, you do better.
And I think that's one of the things too with our parents and our caregivers is that piece of that conversation where we talk about with them, just because you were able to make it through. I always say, did you like it? Did you enjoy it? Yeah. And if it was, then we should want better for the next generation. Yes. And so I always talk about resilience and resistance is that, we are going to put these things in place to be proactive and help our children deal with the society in which they exist. Yes. But we also must insist that society changes as well. It's not good enough to just say, hey, I did it. Yeah, people are going to call you out your name. There's going to be colorism and microaggressions and racism, but I made it.
They talked about Jesus.
Right. I'm fine. You made it. I made it. But instead say, but this is not good. It shouldn't be this way. And that one of the pieces too is this acknowledgement that our goal is also for that to happen less, with the goal eventually of it to not happen at all. And so whenever people are like resilience, I'm like, I believe in resilience and resistance, because we have to be resilient in the moment, but then we also have to resist the idea of that excuse that this is acceptable. Yeah. That when we push resilience to that more weaponized way that we do with our children, it's this acceptability of the systems and this lived experience that is harmful to you, instead of saying that this is wrong. We praise that because then we don't require the systems to change. Yeah. Because we hold you up as having made it. So the system doesn't need to change. It can be as racist, it can be as misogynistic as it wants to be, because we're going to uplift this one person and saying, in spite of all of that, they were okay. And we praise our kids for being okay when, as Dr. Lockhart has mentioned throughout this time, physically, you ain't going to be okay. Emotionally, you're not going to be as okay as you could have been if we fought against it.
Yeah. And we leave no space for them to talk about them not being okay. When we say, you're doing great. The system doesn't have to change, but I made it. You're making it. We're good. We are not good.
We are not. And that's why I wanted to have you all here today.
Yeah.
I appreciate you showing up. Let the people know how they can reach you. We'll start with you, Dr. Tiff.
I'm Dr. Tiffany. You can reach me on all social media platforms at Dr. Tiffany. So that includes LinkedIn, which I'm a little bit more chill, Facebook, Instagram, and even I think on Medium. So.
Oh, are you on Medium?
I am, and on TikTok.
I knew about TikTok. I didn't know about Medium.
I am on Medium.
Okay. You have the best op-eds on your Facebook. It's awesome. If you haven't checked it out, check it out. How about you, Dr. Lockhart?
All right, now I'm gonna have to connect with my soror. So LinkedIn is I'm on there, and so absolutely you can find me there. Send me messages. I am on Instagram as well, Dr. Carrie, and it says Heart Work. It confuses people, but I have an LLC, and it's Heart Work KML. So as in heart work, doing the heart work LLC. So if you look for Dr. Carrie Heart Work, you'll find me on Instagram. And I'm on Twitter a little bit. I have spurts where I'm on there a lot more than others.
Same.
And then, I disappear for a month. So that's twin_doc, DOC. But I get notifications from all three, so you can find me there. Facebook, you won't find me. I'm on there, but you won't find me. That's more my personal page. So, I guess I do have a page there, but I don't. It's not set up. Never mind. So don't worry about that.
Well, I thank you all for coming on to have this conversation with me. I appreciate you, and that's all we have for today. So until next time, have a good one, y'all.
Oh, I forgot about Lodestar. Jeez Louise. And also on the website, lodestarpc.com. But
Gotcha.
I forgot about that.
You've been listening to Strong Conversations, hot takes from a cultural firebrand. Make sure to like our Facebook page at Strong Conversations or follow us on Twitter at Dr. Carolyn Strong. Until next time, have a good one.